So if someone were to come to you and say, I've decided to buy a home, the decision has been made, and there's really two choices in front of me. I either go with an Islamic bank or I go with a traditional conventional bank. What would you do in that situation? So today I'm really happy to report that we have Safdar Alam on the show. He is someone who I've followed on Twitter for many years. He probably doesn't know because he has more than 30,000 Twitter followers. I find his habit of critical thinking and being candid about his conclusions rather refreshing. For those who are unfamiliar with Safdar Alam, Safdar has worked in Islamic banking and finance for over 20 years, leading teams at some of the largest investment banks in the world, including UBS and JP Morgan. Upon reaching a conclusion that Islamic banking in its current form, at least according to Safdar, was based on deception and fundamentally damaging to Muslims globally, Safdar left the banking industry. He became more active in education, running workshops, teaching at university, and writing books in Islamic finance. In recent years, with the growth of fintech, which is short for financial technology, Safdar has become more active in the fintech space, having been the co-founder of the UK Islamic digital bank NIA, and is now CEO of Maydan Capital in the UK, an investment platform that specializes in ethical growth technology companies in the global tech sectors. So with that, Safdar, welcome. It's really awesome to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that introduction. I do know, over the years, we've had a couple of conversations on Twitter. I can't recall the details, but I do recall having some conversations with you on Twitter. So,
okay, good.
But alhamdulillah.
I've always found your candor, as I mentioned, refreshing. So in my intro, I mentioned something that I think will attract a lot of nods from listeners and something that's going to be very infuriating to others, which is the statement that Islamic banking is based on deception and it's actually damaging to Muslims globally. So is this something that you'd like to explain? Why do you think this is?
So just to put a bit of context to that. So when I moved into banking from university, I really moved into investment banking purely as a route to earn as much money as I could. I was young, I was materialistic, and it still is now, I think, quite a well-trodden path for young people to try to earn money fast. And so in London, I went into investment banking, and I was there probably 6 or 7 years, and I was working mainly on the trading floor at UBS. And alhamdulillah, materialistically, everything was going fine. But when I got to my late 20s, I started to change, and everybody develops in their own way. And I realized a couple of things. One was materialistically, it wasn't very satisfying, even though, by the general scale of things, I was on a good salary and earning good money, but I found that wasn't very satisfying. And so I started to think more broadly about my life and what I wanted to achieve. And I actually had made the choice to leave banking because I just did not find it rewarding or challenging. At that time, I found out that there was something called Islamic banking. Now, this is more than 20 years ago. And being in the UK, so immediately I thought this is something fantastic for me because I'd spent the start of my career in finance and banking, and now there was something aligned to my religion. And I was becoming more aware of my religion and as something that's not just rules to follow or something that we're taught from birth, but something for me personally, what it means. And so when I saw an opportunity to practice my expertise in the realm of finance and have it aligned to Islam, for me, this was incredible. I had not heard of that before. And so I went on a mission there to try to move into Islamic finance. And in the UK, it was not very easy. There were not very many things going on at all in Islamic finance. I think only HSBC Amana had set up, and they had a small team in the UK, and that was it. So when I approached them, they said, this summer, we're moving the whole team to Dubai. So in the UK, there's going to be nothing. So I tried for a good one or 2 years.
And what year was this?
So this would have been maybe 99 or 2000. Okay. And they were preparing to move wholesale to Dubai. And the UK, there was no other Islamic banking. So fortunately, through the great work of one of my mentors in Islamic finance, he was a senior executive at UBS, and he managed to push a project through. So for UBS, they started to do Islamic banking. And immediately I went to him and I said, please, can I have a job? In the sense of an internal transfer, because I was working on the trading floor. So I went through an interview process and managed to get a job. And interesting, the first job I was refused. I was rejected. I didn't make it, and they hired somebody else internally from UBS. And that sister actually, after a few months, she had to leave. I think she got married, and I think she went back to Nigeria, where she was from. So they called me after a few months and said, Safdar, this opening's still there. And interestingly, I've kept very loosely in touch with the sister, and she's doing very well. She's actually running an investment house and a bank in Nigeria now, in Islamic finance. So alhamdulillah. So it was a second time of asking after getting rejected. I got a move across. And for me, it was just incredible to learn about my religion, to have it in my profession, work in Islamic banking. And I spent a couple of years learning the ropes. Then I moved to the Middle East, got involved with JP Morgan. I was the global head there of Islamic structuring. And so I spent a good number of years, a decade and a half really at the leading edge of Islamic finance. And this was, I would say, from 2000 to 2010, 2012, this was really, I have to use the correct words, but if you're looking in terms of innovation and development, these were really the golden years of Islamic finance, where a lot of sophisticated players in the market, they turned their view to Islamic finance. And so there was a massive acceleration of growth in terms of customers, banks, and products and markets, and that's the time that I was active. And so I was very active in all stages of Islamic finance. So some of the bigger teams at some more established banks, so HSBC, Citibank, and Deutsche Bank, who had larger teams in Islamic finance, they would have 20, 30, 40 people there. So if you worked in Islamic finance there, you'd work in a particular team. It may be the debt capital markets or investments or treasury. Now, where I worked, just by coincidence at UBS and JP Morgan, they took the business model of having a team of only one or two people. And that was it. So everything you needed to do, you would build your own deal team. You bring in expertise from the various areas of the bank. So that meant when I was involved with products, I was really involved in the deepest way possible. And also it meant that my exposure was to all products in investment banking, because we had to do everything. There were no specialists for me to turn to in Islamic banking. So whether it's in Sukuk, debt capital markets, equity capital markets, syndicated financing, treasury products, liquidity, investments, whatever the trade finance, real estate finance, funds, whatever the banks wanted to do, it was up to me to create that product. And so I would say, very fortunately, my experience was incredibly deep and detailed in all the products that we did. And I worked at a conventional bank in the Islamic banking team. So that meant my clients were all the Islamic banks. So I remember looking a few years ago, I looked at the list of the largest Islamic banks in the world. And a few of them are from Iran, which is it's an anomaly, because in terms of size, they are big, but they're not openly transparent like other banks, and they're not openly active in the market. So you don't really have them as Islamic banking clients. And so if you took out the banks from Iran, I looked at the top 30 Islamic banks by size, and I think 29 of them were my clients that I would know and meet and execute transactions. And so I had to know intimately how Islamic banks work, how Islamic banking works, and also because I worked at conventional banks, they're and I think maybe you'd probably be aware of this. They're incredibly demanding, right? So if you don't perform to a very high level, and your bottom line is to earn profit for the bank, right? And if you're not earning this year after year, my profit targets, every year they would be going up like $5 million, $20 million, $50 million per year. And if you're not earning that, then you're gone, right? There's no space for failing to meet your targets in Islamic banking. It was incredibly demanding. So I was in a role where I had to perform things at an incredibly high level and at a very demanding level, and I had to deliver profits to my employer. And so that forced me to get experience. I wasn't in a position where I could get things wrong. I wasn't in a position where I could approach things with 50% knowledge and try to wing things. If I didn't know what I was doing, the business would fail. And so the point I'm making here is that my experience was incredibly fortunate and incredibly deep, and it's not typical of an Islamic banker. So I recall, for example, when I was in the mid-level, I was in Bahrain, and there was an event organized by the Central Bank of Bahrain, and they invited, I think I was at Credit Agricole in the time in Bahrain, and they invited all the major players in Islamic finance. So there were 15 or 20 senior bankers, and I went there to represent my bank. And this was, they were trying to develop some standardization for commodity murabaha at the time. So the deputy governor was there, and it was a big round table. Everyone had their microphones, and he asked a question, and they were all heads of treasury. They were not junior guys. And he said, can somebody explain to me how commodity murabaha works? So 2 or 3 heads of treasury of Islamic banks explained to him. Now, in my role, I was the guy who created all the contracts for these Islamic banks, right? And so when they see, it's like the tip of the iceberg. When they see what they execute, I'm the guy who's developing everything underneath, right? So the forced knowledge I had to have is far superior than a market participant. And I realized they were making mistakes in their explanation. They were not explaining it correctly. They only explained to what they knew. And then when they tried to create a circle of how the transaction works and how the markets works, they were making mistakes in what they said. And I was in the middle level at that time. All these guys were senior. I didn't want to say anything, but after about 10 or 15 minutes, I had to. I had a microphone, and I said, I have to interrupt. I'm sorry, but a lot of the things what these guys are saying are wrong. And so I explained how the process works, and I explained the touch points that Islamic banks have. They have specific touch points in a much wider structure. And so for them, it appears a certain way, but in reality, it's not represented correctly when you ask them. And these were very senior guys at Islamic banks. And so in my role, as well as working on the contracts and the products and the pricing and execution, of course, I worked very closely with scholars. Every bank I worked at, even the conventional banks, we have our own Sharia board of scholars. And I worked very closely with them. And because the banks I worked for, they have more money than anybody else, right? So they hired the how can I say, the most prominent scholars in the world, who were the most expensive scholars to hire. So we had like the rock stars of Islamic finance, right? And these are all incredible scholars. And I worked very closely with them for all our transactions. And also, when I do a transaction with an Islamic bank, it's my job to make sure the contract meets their requirements. Right, I can't just stop at my Sharia board and say this is fine. I have to understand what their Sharia board wants, and there's a lot of commonalities, but there's a lot of differences. So I had to become expert in what each Islamic bank did, and they all operate a bit differently. So one thing I always have a lot of respect for one Islamic bank in Saudi, which is Al Rajhi, which is the largest one in the world. Their scholars were the most impressive to me because they were the ones who rejected most of the stuff that the market does. And I remember we'd have meetings with them, and their scholars don't speak English. So I would have to take a translator with me from my bank. We would go across, and we would present all kinds of products to them that were quite normal in the market. And I'd have my friend translating in Arabic. They would speak in Arabic, and he'd translate in English. And they would reject 90% of the stuff that we would put to them because the market's accepting it. And they would say, no, this is not right. We won't do it. And for me, it meant that bank was the hardest bank for me to work with in terms of doing deals. But those scholars were the ones I had the most respect for because they weren't budging. And that was the only bank that I came across that had that stance.
Do you know perhaps if those scholars are still in their place?
I think they are because Al-Rajhi, so they hired scholars that typically don't work for any other bank. So they hire scholars that are full-time only for their Sharia board. They're not scholars who sit on 10 or 20 Sharia boards. Right. And their stance was consistent. In the decade or so now since I've last communicated with them, I'm not sure how things have changed. I mean, I've spoken to senior members who are there, and they say it's a little bit disappointing. It has changed a little bit, but that bank stood out for me as they were really trying to stick as well as they could to the real principles of Sharia. So
the reason I asked that, by the way, is because I spoke with another sort of insider in the industry, and he, from his perspective, albeit he was He was based in Dubai, and I think he was talking about banks there as opposed to Saudi Arabia. But what he said is that there was a lot of fatwa shopping going on, and that scholars that were sort of hard-headed were not the scholars that got the most business, and it was indeed scholars that were more lenient that became more popular over time in the industry. Did you see any of that, or is that not your experience?
I absolutely saw that. I mean, there's no doubt that is correct, and this is also, it's a natural manifestation of market forces, right? If you're in Islamic bank and you're there to do business and make money, and so first of all, you've got to appoint some scholars as your Sharia board, and you appoint some scholars, and if one of those scholars is regularly taking a stance that he's not approving the business you want to do because he thinks it's not ethical, then over time, I think Al-Raji is maybe the exception, but all the other banks, over time, it means that these scholars would eventually be replaced and nobody would hire them because they're not an economic investment for those banks. So in general, you see the people who advise the banks are the ones who it's very well understood that, they approve certain things and they approve what the market needs. And so that's another reason why when you look at the spread of Sharia scholars amongst banking, you see, a small number of scholars and a very high number of boards. There was some work done a few years ago, and I can't remember which company did it, and they looked at how many boards each scholars were advising on, and the key half a dozen most reputable scholars in the world in Islamic finance, they were serving on 30, 40, 50 different boards of institutions. And part of that is market forces. If a scholar is going to prove something, that's a commodity. It's valuable, right? And but also you get some practical limitations of that. That if you have scholars advising 50 different institutions, it's very difficult to get hold of them. Right? If you say, look, we need to have a board meeting, or I have a 200-page document I need you to review, it's very difficult for them to be responsive because their demand and their time is so high. So my involvement in Islamic finance has been intimate and it's been deep, and even today now, I'm an incredible believer in my religion and its connection with finance and enterprise. I think how our religion demands us to approach it it's incredibly wise. And even now I'm doing a very small course for a small group of people, and we do it on Saturdays. And and I speak about how our religion reviews sales transactions and business and finance. We're going back to Hadith and Quran and analyzing them in some detail, because I don't think that critical analysis it exists enough today on Hadith to do with finance and investment, and every week I'm discovering the wisdom in our religion about how it approaches transactions and enterprise and risk, and to me it's absolutely incredible. So when I come, the main reason I give this background is that when I then criticize Islamic banking is one section of our religion's approach to finance. Unfortunately, in the market, the way the market develops, so at the moment, there's about $3 trillion of assets in Islamic finance. About 95% of those assets are involved in the banking system, right? About 75% directly in banks and about 20% in Sukuk, which is the debt capital markets. Now, combined, it's 95% plus of all the assets in the world revolve around Islamic banking. Now, my contention and my position is Islamic banking itself is an industry built on riba. And to me, it's absolutely clear. But there's a whole world of finance and investment outside of Islamic banking itself. So I guess we call it Islamic finance. But at the moment, that's only 5% or less of what's practiced today. So I do have a real issue with the Islamic banking side of Islamic finance. And that's the vast majority of Islamic finance that the most of us would see every day.
So what happened, what sort of clicked in your mind when you were working in Islamic finance? Was there like an aha moment that you had where you were like, oh, this is wrong. This is based on not the tenets of my religion as I understand them. Was there a moment like that, or was it just like a gradual process where you became disillusioned with the entire industry?
I think it was a gradual process. I remember when I joined, so I was in my late 20s, and so I mentioned my mentor at UBS. He's the one who set up the department. And he said to me the very first day, he said, Safdar, he said, you're going to see some things that maybe you won't like, but he said, you've got to take a long-term view. And this is an industry that's young and it's changing. And I remember his words. So I would say that if you work in Islamic banking, and a lot of Muslims do, in the West, in the US, in the UK, we don't see much Islamic banking. But when you go to the Middle East, Malaysia, Indonesia, it's common. It's incredibly common. There are dozens of Islamic banks, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people who work in them. Right? It's a well-established industry in many parts of the world. So what led me along the journey to that kind of realization is that, first of all, and I explained briefly about my role, that it was not enough for me to be superficial on transactions, because I had to create transactions. And when I did, when I worked in an international institution, in conventional banks, and I approached them and I said, guys, we need to do X transaction. We need to develop this business. And they would say, okay, this is new business for our bank. And we have a whole infrastructure that we've built to deal with new business. So you've got to take this through the new business process. So that means I had to then present papers in the investment bank to experts in various aspects of the bank to prove to them this is business the bank wants to do. So, for example, I had to speak to lawyers. I had to explain the contracts for them word by word, precisely what it means. I had to speak to compliance. I had to speak to the risk people to understand, make them understand what the transactions do, how they're booked, what the risk means. I had to talk about pricing and distribution, and operations. I had to explain to the operations team how to book the deals, what systems to use, what to book at what time. So when you're involved at that level, you have, like I said, if I don't know my business, these products are not being approved. If they're not being approved, I'm not making profit. If I'm not making profit, I'm out the door in 2 months. So this was an integral part of my daily life. And I think because I was forced to go that route, which I'm forever grateful for, I think a lot of practitioners in Islamic finance, the vast majority, never have to go into that depth, right? So you see the tips of the iceberg, for example. And so because I had seen everything, so slowly things started to dawn on me that, for example, if you look at the fatwa issued by an Islamic bank for a certain product, that fatwa is incredibly limited. It explains a couple of things that happen, and it says these things are Sharia compliant. Mm-hmm. Whereas in reality, I know the 20 other things that happen underneath the surface in order to make this thing happen. And there's no way these things are Sharia compliant. So, but it took me some time to realize that. And I would say it was a journey of realization, but through most of it, I was very optimistic. I thought, things, I'm going to find something that's good. I'm going to find something that can improve it. And so I did have some exposure to some of the good things. I mentioned the 5%. So there were some funds that we had set up, some investments, but they were very much in the minority. And I think this disillusionment became more real, and I began to understand that this is something that will not change. And then I began to understand that this is something that cannot change. When I realized it's something that cannot change, and that for me, that was the final nail in the coffin, as it were. So it was, because up to then, I think I'd felt that there was still room for change. Mm. And when I spoke to my peers, I had some peers who had a similar level of experience to me. Without exception, we were on the same boat, right? We all agreed with what we said amongst. There was no doubt, because if you disagreed with such fundamental observations, it showed that you don't understand what you're talking about. There's it's not easy to explain, but disagreement is not possible. The only outcome that can look like disagreement is ignorance. If you don't know something and then you take a different position, that's the only way that you can disagree with certain facts, right? But people who I knew who had experience and knowledge that was on a par with me, we never had any difference of opinion. But of course, when you're in the system and you're employed by banks and Islamic banks and your salary is paid by them, you're quite limited in what you can say openly.
Right. There's a lot there to unpack, I guess. I do want to ask you about why is it that you lost hope in change in the industry? And I'm assuming the answer involves the lack of economic incentive to change. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think so. So when you look at the highest level of the institutions, from the CEOs and the directors downwards, as you said, there's no incentive to change because Islamic banking operates a certain way. Islamic banks are making a lot of money, right? Because they're lending money. Banks always make money. There's no incentive for them to rock the boat and change fundamentally what they do. And in terms of the people involved in Islamic finance, so whether it's heads of departments or employees in operations or risks or sales, again, they're only exposed to a very small part of, as a consequence of their role. And also, on the whole, I think the vast majority of Muslims that I met who worked in the sector are just normal, genuine people. There are Muslims who, like me, see it as something good that they're working in Islamic finance. It's aligned with their deen. And it's, if they were anything like me, it was like the culmination of a real desire to move into the industry. And these are just normal, genuine people. There are some people at some level who I think do understand the deep contradiction in there, but I think they're not incentivized to change it. And one thing I face just on that point of Muslims is that one very often regular criticism that is pointed towards me is that when I criticize the activities of banks, it's said to me that, well, you're criticizing scholars, that you're saying scholars are wrong. And I think that's a very difficult point for people to understand, because I'm not saying scholars are wrong. I'm saying scholars are asked to approve very limited things. And so one of the parts of my role was to obtain Sharia approval for products. I had to do this, and I had to get fatwa signed by scholars. So, in the classic times of Islamic courts, the structure they had was that they would have a judge for the court, a judge who's a political appointee. The judge is not necessarily a mufti, right? But the judge would have access to a mufti. So he would obtain the facts of the case from the plaintiff, the defendant, and the representatives, and then he would present just the relevant facts to the mufti, like on a no-name basis, because the mufti doesn't need to know the names of the people. He would just present, these are the facts, A, B, C. The mufti would then say, based on what you've told me, these are the rulings. He would present a ruling. And then the judge would have the freedom whether he wanted to implement these rulings or not. He could overrule them. But the fatwa was very specific based on what the judge was based on what the mufti was told. So this is how Islamic finance works. So I was speaking to scholars all the time. I mentioned to you this was a time of great innovation, but innovation in a secular sense, not in realms of worship. So we were doing so many new things, and regularly I would sit with scholars of my bank and other banks and explain to them what's going on. And the aim is to get Sharia approval. Now, when I was forced to get as much knowledge as was demanded of me, what I explained to people is purely a function of my decision what to explain to them, right? And that's a function of what do I need to explain to them in order to get an outcome that I want. And so then if you ask me to present any structure, which I know is not Sharia compliant, but if I present it to a scholar, I'm sorry, but it's very easy for me to get an approval from scholars. I mean, I remember speaking to one of the scholars who's one of the foremost scholars in the world, and there was a particular transaction we wanted approval for. And it was important for us because there was a lot of money riding on it. And I presented it to him. And he was a very sharp scholar. And he said, no. He said, you can't do this. And I said, okay. Then I tweaked something else. And he said, no, you can't do this. And then I had like my final argument, which I knew would work. And I remember I was in a conversation and there were one or two other guys, because he gave approval to people who were waiting in a queue, because he was very popular. So there were some bankers and lawyers like my peers who were sitting next to me and they were waiting. So they were all having a bit of a joke with me because they know I'm trying to get Sharia approval. So I said to the scholar, I said, look, this is the final thing I'm going to say. I said, as a Muslim, I don't want to say this to you, but I said, as a banker, this is what I have to do. Then I went through a structure with him. I knew he would approve, and he approved it. And as a Muslim, I hated it. But he knew what I was presenting to him and how I presented it. It was Sharia compliant. So in terms of what I wanted to do,
I want to try and understand this better. So your argument to the scholar was perhaps the substance of this transaction is not something as a Muslim, you would normally do, but if we change the form, then perhaps we can get it to something where you say it's permissible. Is that what your basic argument was? Yeah. So is a change in form not a change in substance, and the scholar approved of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the substance is very difficult. It's very easy to withhold. It's like, if I'm trying to give an example that's not insulting, but the substance is not known to that many people. And so when you're in control of that substance, you control what you say to people.
So it sort of seems like, from what you're describing, that the scholars you interacted with were sincere.
Absolutely.
And yet perhaps were lacking in financial knowledge, perhaps, in order to be able to ascertain, exactly what was going on.
Yeah. So so there's two important points. One is in terms of scholars being sincere. I mean, this is something I've never been able to question, and I'd never want to question. I've never been in a position where I should question it. And how we Muslims we're brought up, that we have an incredible amount of respect for scholars. Right. And that's how I was brought up, and that's never changed for me. The scholars I went to, these were scholars who were leaders in their community. I mean, in the middle of our meetings, we would stop and they would walk to the local mosque where they're the imam, and we would pray, and everybody would come, and then we'd finish and we'd come back. So me, in terms of holding the scholars with an immense amount of respect, is just a natural thing, and that's never changed. But when I present something to scholars, I present it to them having created all the infrastructure that's required for the product. Now, much of that infrastructure I don't want to tell the scholar, because it's not in my benefit to tell him, because it's absolutely not Islamic at all. So it's for me then to devise from the superficial elements of it, what do I present to the scholar that can be opined upon? Because at the end, a fatwa is going to be given. The fatwa will say specifically what's been explained to the scholar, and he'll give approval on that. But there's many things
I'm gonna ask a tough question, but it seems like, from what you're describing, while you were in the Islamic finance industry, you actually knew during that time that what you were doing wasn't necessarily substantive. It was actually just form, and then after a while, it weighed on your conscience. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, whereas for other people who aren't so deeply involved, you might see something and you say, well, I think there's a chance that something dodgy is going on. My role was to actually, the things that are dodgy was to actually contractualize them, right? Because in banking and investment banking, there can be no uncertainty as to who's doing what and what the obligations are. So, for example, I'll give an example that, I'm not sure how easily it'll translate verbally, but in commodity murabaha, in tawaruk, which is the most widely used product. I mean, just today, I published a thread on it, so I'll be writing for a couple of days on Twitter. It's used in over 90% of transactions in Islamic banking today. So I was 15 years ago, we were creating the building blocks of this. So one of the fundamental things that made this product Sharia compliant on the surface was that you have two commodity brokers who act independently. Right? This had to be the case, because if they act in collusion, then you have the issue of organized transactions, and then you have commodity murabaha or tawaruk. If it's organized, it really bears no difference to a bay al-inna. And a bay al-inna is, when it's organized, it's all four madhabs deem it impermissible. Right. So you had to have this distance between the two brokers. Now, as a bank who's pushing money around this system, we could not afford any distance between these two brokers. We could not afford to let them go and walk in the park and decide what they want to do. We had to contractualize their obligations. So one of the questions I would ask those two brokers, I would say, show me your contracts where you contractualize your relationship. And they would, because they have to. This document can never, ever, ever be shown to scholars. It cannot even be admitted to scholars. And scholars, they don't. So this is what a typical scholar would ask. The scholar would ask in the context of these two brokers. He would say, first of all, do they have any commercial relationship or constitutional relationship? I would say no. He said, Are they part of the same group? No. Are they owned by the same parents? No. Then he would say that, do they have the same directors? No. And then the questions would end. Then the assumption is they're acting independently.
But
now,
they wouldn't ask, do they have a contract between them?
No, I was never asked that.
Yeah, it seems like that would be like an obvious question to ask. Is that just like the scholars perhaps like assuming that wasn't the case because it was such an obvious violation? Or why wouldn't a scholar ask that? It seems like that would be like the first when you're trying to ascertain if there's a relationship between them, that would be the first question to ask.
I think there's a few reasons for that. So one is the Sharia advisor is acting on behalf of one party only that he's employed by. He's employed by the Islamic Bank or my bank. Now, in a common tawarruk, there's four counterparties. There's the bank itself, there's two commodity brokers, and there's a customer, which can be another bank. Now, he's not acting on, the Sharia scholar is not acting on the behalf of any of the three other counterparties, only the Islamic Bank. So often his focus is on the transactions that involve that Islamic Bank. The transaction or the relationship between the two commodity brokers, technically, it's not in the remit of his sphere of approval, circle of approval, because he's not in control of what random third parties do.
I see.
So I think there's just a couple of questions that are asked. Now, but for me, I had to know the markets as well as I know them. For me, I know it's absolutely inconceivable for a bank to leave itself open to such a risk that it must demand contractual relationships.
Right.
It just cannot work in any other way. So one other way that the practical reality and what's presented to scholars, that another way to materialize is, for example, when the bank is giving a loan to a third party, whether it's a personal finance or interbank loan, the transaction of money, according to the paper, it leaves the bank and it goes through to commodity brokers, right? And these are, in the interbank market, these are very large. So in my early days, I was booking these transactions. I was a dealer in the interbank commodity murabaha market. So that's another way I got to know. And so these transactions were $50 million, $200 million, large. And we would technically have to give money to a commodity broker. And then it's passed through to the bank two or three transactions. Now, these commodity brokers are very small companies. Their balance sheets are literally in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the bank has been asked to pass $200 million through them. Right. So when I had to put this through compliance at UBS and JP Morgan. And they said to me, how on earth do you expect us to pay a company $200 million when their balance sheet is $100,000? They said, Safdar, this is never, ever, ever, ever going to happen. And I said, guys, but we need to do this. So the solution we found was that we forced the brokers to create nostro accounts on the balance sheet of our bank. So we said, we're going to credit your account. And when we credit your account at $200 million, there's no way ever that you will have access to that money, right? So we will create in such a locked account that the only instructions you can ever give is that we take it from that account and we credit another account. And those instructions were heavily documented. They were watertight. So the brokers would never, ever see the money. So that's the commercial reality. But what he presents to scholars is to say, look, you say, Sheikh, we're passing money around. We don't want risk of settlement. We need to do it quickly. So we're going to open an account in the name of the broker on our balance sheet. And the Sheikh said, that sounds prudent. You should do that.
I guess hence the word that you used, which was deception in terms of
it has to be
a lot of the practices.
Yeah.
I always found it kind of odd that Islamic finance endeavored to regulate itself through Sharia boards that were employed by the banks themselves. So it's odd to think of a regulator getting paid by the party that they're entrusted with regulating, and it sort of seems akin to the problem that happened in the United States with credit rating agencies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where they were being paid by the parties requesting the rating, and therefore they had a financial incentive to provide generous ratings.
Yeah.
And we all know what happened in 2008. Do you share that view in terms of like structurally the regulation seems off? Like the regulation should be by a third independent party that's not really employed by the banks.
Yes, I fully agree with you that this conflict is very apparent in the structure of the credit ratings agencies. But interestingly, I would say, so there's 2 points to make of that. I would say in Malaysia, for example, they have taken some steps to try to reduce that conflict, where all products that banks want to execute, they have to be approved by a central Sharia advisory board, the SAC, which is part of Bank Negara. So even if they get approval internally from their Sharia scholars, they also need approval from the central Sharia advisory board. The SAC, Sharia Advisory
Wouldn't that render the internal Sharia advisory board basically obsolete or useless?
So then you could say that their role is maybe it's more operational, that once the product has received high level approval at the national level, their focus is more on, well, are we executing it aligned with the approval that we've got? So it's more like audit or governance, perhaps, which is a very important role. So the point I'm making is that even though Malaysia has gone that route, there's no substantive difference in their operations. Right? They're still doing the same things. Right. So that conflict seems to have been moved from one arena to another, but it's not been resolved. And just to illustrate that very real conflict, so we have a Sharia standard setting board called AOFI in Bahrain. And in my views, they are the best Sharia standards I've seen, but they're still not very good in practical terms, but they're the best that I've seen. They are certainly a bit stronger than the Sharia standards set in Malaysia, I think, a bit stronger. And one of the ways that they're a bit stronger is that if you look at the standards, now these are 1,000 plus pages long, and I'm intimately familiar with all of them. So if you look at the standards, there are clues in there that they're sort of trying to retain some integrity. So one of them is that when you go back to commodity murabaha for a personal loan, part of this cycle is that the customer buys commodity from the bank and he pays for it on a deferred basis. Now, this commodity, the customer's got to sell it. In order to try to prove that the whole cycle of transactions is not arranged, and it's not pre-arranged, AOFI Sharia standards say when this customer sells the commodity, they say the Islamic bank cannot act as the agent of the customer. They say, let him sell it because he's bought it. That means he wants you to buy it. So let him sell it because he should know how to sell it. Islamic banks, without exception, act as agent of the customer in personal finance. They have to, because the customer's got no idea how to sell tin or Z or lead or copper, or in Malaysia, they do crude palm oil and they do like tins of milk. The customer's got no idea what he's doing. He just wants to loan. So the Islamic bank has to act as it has to act as the agent.
I find that hilarious. Someone goes to get a loan, and all of a sudden they're involved in trading palm oil or something like that. I find that hilarious.
It's crazy, isn't it? And then, so I remember speaking to one of my friends who's at AOFI. I've known quite a few people there, but he was speaking to me about something, and I spoke to him last year, and I said that we were talking about something, and I said, by the way, do you know your Sharia standards, which are very good, on this page, in this clause, you say something that Islamic banks cannot act as agent for their customer. He goes, I know that. And I said, do you also know that every single bank in the world breaks your rules? He goes, yes, we know that. And I said, well, what do you do about it? And he said, we can't do anything. He said, because if we try to do something, like, we're too marginal, nobody will pay attention to us. So AOFI rules, and also with Sukuk, right? I don't do many YouTube videos, but I did one that's about 2 hours long, and it's about Sukuk. The rules are just explicitly disregarded by the market. People just don't pay attention to them. And this ties back to your point about the regulator. The regulator, AOFI, has no power to enforce its rules because it relies on the goodwill of the banks. The banks are funding it. The banks are funding its operations and funding its salaries. So
it's not really an independent regulator.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate.
Dependent on the approval of the banks.
Yeah. And that's a practical market matter where conflicts introduced. But that's not saying, all the Muslims and the scholars involved with AOFI are not sincere, genuine people.
Right.
But the market is the market is brutal, right? The market is. I remember quoting this in my trading days. One of the traders from over 100 years ago, he said, "The market is a tyrant, right? The market, it takes no prisoners. You can't hide from it. So this is not it's not an aspersion on Muslims or individuals involved. It's just that the market is incredibly powerful."
One of the I think very profound economic principles that I'd like to remind myself of in entrepreneurship and investing in everything is that what you incentivize happens, period.
Yeah.
What you incentivize happens. So when you have problems, just look at the incentive system behind it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's your problem.
Yeah.
And that's where the change needs to happen. It's not about personnel, as you said. I mean, the people are, the vast majority of them, I think it's safe to assume, are sincere. Yeah. They're trying to do the right thing, but the incentive system is out of whack.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Sukuk, and I actually mentioned Sukuk in my latest one of my recent videos, and I also reached the same conclusion that I found them a bit haram. Like these were debt instruments that were not unlike bonds, and they were being packaged in a way that was appealing to Muslims, and that was really the only difference I saw between them and bonds. I know that some people argue that it's rent and so on, but it clearly isn't if you look a bit deeper into each of these Sukuk products that are out there. But I do think that, a counter argument to this would be like someone bringing up like one Sukuk that actually, was different. Yeah. But my point is the vast majority of them, as far as I can tell, the vast majority of them seem to be just debt instruments that are motivated by profit and therefore ribawi, but they're repackaged in a way that's appealing to Muslims. So what other products do you think just the average Muslim is engaged in, involved in, is a customer of, that you find objectionable, that Muslim may be thinking that, oh, this is halal? For example, the halal mortgages, I should say, quote unquote, halal mortgages that people get from Islamic banks. Do you think those are halal? And are there other products that you think, okay, these are clearly not halal, but the average Muslim thinks that they are?
Yeah. So, in terms of terminology, personally, I hesitate using halal and haram because Muslims, these are heavy terms for Muslims, and so I'm not disputing your use of them. I took them personally. This is something I found out. So how people react.
You're right, actually, and I try to use comfortable and uncomfortable instead of halal and haram, basically saying I'm uncomfortable with it as opposed to it's halal. So you're right. I actually share your sentiment on this wholeheartedly.
Okay, good. And then so I used to talk about riba, and even riba. Then, if you say something, in my view, something has riba, then people will say, well, you're saying scholars are approving things as riba. And it's a very difficult conversation because too many terms are emotionally loaded in our deen. So I try to focus on interest because So riba is much, much more complicated and wider than interest. But as far as I know, the overwhelming opinion is that interest on loans is riba, is a part of riba. So I focus on interest. So in terms of products, I would say pretty much every lending product that any Islamic bank gives is built on interest. There's no other way for them to do it. So I remember analyzing the balance sheet of some banks, because before I moved into banking, I qualified as a chartered accountant with KPMG. So I found I know my way around financial statements. And so I analyzed the financial statements of quite a few banks. And my results were consistent. I analyzed banks, an Islamic bank in the UK, a few in the GCC, and a few in Malaysia. And their percentage of assets and liabilities, which were built upon interest, varied from 96 to 99%. And that was me being a bit conservative. There were some things that were not clear, and I assumed they're not interest. So assets and liabilities, both, right? So, but once you understand what a bank does, it's no surprise. But it is surprising for people when you say it's an Islamic bank. So I would say any financing product from an Islamic bank it's built on interest. There's absolutely no doubt about it. The only variability is, as if you analyze it, how well you understand banking, how well you can analyze the contracts, and how transparent the banks are in their products and structures. So, for example, some banks like Al Halal Bank in the UAE and Mizan Bank in Pakistan, I really like those banks because their websites are incredibly transparent. Like even Al Hilal Bank today, for something I was doing, I downloaded two of their fatwas they provide. They provide their fatwas online, and they provide really detailed works of explanations of what they're doing. And Mizan Bank is similar. Not many Islamic banks do that. So the only barrier between, I would say, someone like me who understands banking and making it clear, if I look at something a bank does and I can say clearly it's interest or not, the only times I can't say it's interest is when the bank's not transparent in their contract, right? Because they're not obliged to put their contract online. In Malaysia, they're quite good. They have to put key risk documents online, and they outline everything they do, and it's very clear it's built on interest. So home finance, 2 points to make. One is that it's no different to any lending by the bank. Islamic bank, it's built on interest. There's no doubt about that, no matter how much they try to hide it in the complexity of the agreements. But that goes on to a slightly wider agreement as to what do Muslims do, and that's that's an area that I think I try to take a step back from, because my initial approach is, does something contain interest? Is it a loan at interest? And every single mortgage I've seen from every single Islamic bank in the world, undoubtedly, it's built on interest.
Right.
But there's a slightly wider discussion around that as to what do Muslims do? Do we need to buy a home? How do we buy a home? And I'll leave that a little more to the commentators on or advisors on Muslims in their daily lives, because that's very difficult advice to give. And as a general point, when people approach me for comments and advice, I really try not to give advice to people because I'm not qualified to do it. But I can point out some technical things to them.
So, if someone were to come to you and say, I've decided to buy a home, the decision has been made, right?
Yeah.
And there's really two choices in front of me. I either go with an Islamic bank or I go with a traditional conventional bank. What would you do in that situation?
Right. Okay. So I'm really reluctant to advise people, but if I put myself in that situation,
sure.
And I have done, and I've stated this, and I stated it on Twitter a few months ago, and people got mixed reactions. So there's no doubt in my mind, I would see it as a Muslim, a more transparent and honest decision for me would be to go with a conventional bank, right? So riba is a great sin. There's no doubt about that. But if I'm going to, approach my Creator and ask for forgiveness for riba, I'd rather do it and engage with a conventional bank, right? Why? So if I engage with an Islamic bank, this is for the knowledge and the experience and level that I have, there's absolutely no difference in the product. There's no level of uncertainty in my mind. If you as an individual have uncertainty that an Islamic product, maybe it's riba, maybe it's not, then you have to make your own decision. But for me, I don't have that excuse. Mm-hmm. I can't claim ignorance. So right. I have a choice. There's a riba product by an Islamic bank or a riba product by a conventional bank. Now, in my thinking, it's because of the systemic deception that's involved in Islamic banking. I can't support it. I really can't support it. I would not even open a current account at an Islamic bank. I refuse to do that. In the UK, my current account's at a conventional bank. Right? And
this is going to be very tough for people to hear. And
people, but
and
for
uncomfortable.
Me, I mean, but for me, I can say this comes back to the level of knowledge that I have. And if you could imagine that if somebody says to you, I'm not going to an Islamic bank, I'm going to a conventional bank. And if you think that sounds weird and that sounds odd, then, I would just say, remember what I told you about my experience and my level of knowledge. And I've come to this conclusion. So, there's a chance maybe I see something that you don't, right? And ultimately, it's my choice. I'm never advocating going to conventional banks because riba is a sin. It's a sin. Yeah. It's a phenomenal sin. Right. But I'm saying in my choice, if I'm going to meet my creator, and if I'm going to say to him, I was involved in riba, I want to say I did it knowing what I was doing with conventional banks, and I ask your forgiveness. I don't want to say I did it trying to trick somebody in the contracts and deception and try to pretend it's not riba. And part of my reasoning behind that is that I don't think Islamic banks just operate in a vacuum where they offer these products. I think it's incredibly damaging to Muslims. The existence of Islamic banks is incredibly damaging because you've got to look at what's flowed into those banks, right? One is there's a huge amount of goodwill that Muslims direct to those banks.
Right.
There's also capital. Money's going to those banks. Human resources. There are tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of employees at these banks. There are lawyers, scholars, regulators. Just imagine all that intellectual capacity that's being directed to those banks. And that's a complete waste. It's a complete betrayal of all of that. If you imagine that resource, whether it's money, people, goodwill, if it had been redirected 40, 50 years ago, if it'd been redirected to something productive, just imagine where we would be today. So this is one thing I said, that Islamic banking is actually worse. The fact that they exist it's worse than if they did not exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so because I feel very angry about that. And so because of that position,
in its current form, we should say, in its current form, you're not against the concept of Islamic finance, but just the current implementation of Islamic finance today, you find problems with it.
Right. Just to be clear on that, I'm trying in my terminology, I'm trying to be consistent and say it's Islamic banking.
Right.
So this is purely Islamic
we should say
banking.
like Islamic banking or banking that's marketed as Islamic, perhaps.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. But I do see some wonderful things going on in the broader Islamic space where Muslims are active. And in the introduction, you mentioned fintech. I think that's been a fantastic development for Muslims. And I see some really great implementations of Islamic finance. And I'm incredibly supportive of them. I mean, I'm supporting and advising and working with like 3 or 4 startups in the Islamic finance space, and I'm fully committed to that space.
You're free to plug their names if you'd like.
So I would say, so first of all, because of the stance that I take, and I'm not big on social media, but on Twitter I'm active, and if you follow me, you know that I'm relentless on riba, and the reason I'm relentless is because I feel an incredible level of betrayal and outrage, and I can't see that ever stopping for me. So, with the position that I come from, I'm fully aware that what I associate myself with, I'm very careful with that, right? Because I leave with my very strong stance. I leave myself open to potential accusations of hypocrisy or double standards in what I support. So I'm very choosy in who I associate myself with and what I've done. So the projects I've been involved with. So first of all, me and some friends set up Nia Bank in the UK, and about a year or two ago, 18 months ago, this was acquired by Wahed Invest. And I think very soon that's going to be launched as a product. So Wahed Invest is going to launch a banking platform to connect with this investment platform. And so strategically, they acquired Nia. So I am a board advisor at Wahed Invest. I really believe in their long-term vision. And I'm saying that with my view.
Did you see my last video on Wahed Invest?
I have not, no.
Yeah, take a look at it.
And,
I'm sure
so
some
I
of the
know.
audience members are probably laughing right now.
Yeah. So yeah.
I had a pretty rough review of their robo advisory service.
Yeah, I know, and I know there's been some news in the last month or two as well in the US. So I would say the reason I'm happy to be advisor of White Investors because I see directly from the top the long term vision of where they want Muslims to be.
Yeah, and I should clarify, like, there's no like, um, I actually. I sincerely wish them the best. I have nothing but goodwill towards them. It was just I when I review products, I tend to be very candid and just say things as I see them, and that's how the review went. But I fully support the actual like mission that they aspire to serve, which is providing financial solutions for Muslims. That's definitely something that I'm fully behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you in terms of if you get to the technical side of products, it's a commercial marketplace and it's there to be reviewed and critically analyzed. And that's welcome with the guys. So I remember one of the senior guys, he said to me, Safdar, why don't you do a critical review of our products at White? And I said, guys, be careful what you ask me, because if I do it, the reason I say this is, for example, I know, Wahed invest in their portfolios, they invest in Sukuk, right? And I know there's some.
That was one of the points I brought up. Yeah,
and I know that the strategically they want to move away from that, but it's not easy to move away. So I said to them, for example, if you ask me to review your products, I'm going to say Sukuk are interest-based instruments, and they said to me, that's fine. If you do review, they just be completely honest and say what you think. So I think on the implementation, as a consequence of where the markets are, there are things that can be improved. But in terms of where they want to be, what services they want to deliver to Muslims, I'm a big supporter of them. And so another startup that, it is a startup that I'm working at with my company, which is Maidan Capital. We're looking to help Muslims to invest into ethical startups. By ethical, ideally, I want it to be Muslim startups, Muslim founders, just supporting them on their journey. I've had quite a few companies.
So sort of like a VC fund. Is it venture capital or?
It'll be VC, but probably not as big as VC. And at the moment, we're in terms of size, we execute on a transaction by transaction basis. So I think in due course, once we get up and running and our process is more like a factory line, then I think we will probably go the route of funds, establishing funds, because execution is a bit easier. But at the moment, we do transaction by transaction. So if we see a good deal, we do a lot of due diligence and vetting on it. If we think it's a good deal, then we take it to our investor base and we raise. We like looking at seed rounds because that's obviously they're more risky than Series A and Series B, but that's a risk that I think me and my team were quite comfortable with. We like that stage of risk. We think that's a really good place to be present. And so we're doing what we can. So the reason I mentioned this is because one of the things that I wish I'm waiting to be improved, and whether it's Wahed or other investment vehicles, is that when we're taking money from Muslims, we have so little choice where to deploy the money that immediately what we do is we deploy it outside of the Muslim infrastructure straight away. And,
so a follow-up on this that I've been eager to ask is, so where do Muslims put their money? If Sukuk are haram, is it just all in equity? Is there any sort of fixed income option for the average Muslim that doesn't involve them, actively managing property that they can invest their money in?
And this is a very difficult question. So first of all, I would say that kind of asset class, where in conventional terms, it's like a debt product, right? A DCM asset class, Sukuk, where you get some protection of capital and you get some returns. It always involves interest in a conventional space. And this is a fundamental need that investors have, because you don't want to be putting all your money into the stock market. You can't. You want some secure investments where you'll get some return, but you want a good level of certainty your capital's there. The Sukuk offers that protection, but as the only way it does it is because it's an interest-based product and it has an obligation to repay. And for me, that's not healthy. It's interest. So the fact that Muslims don't have these opportunities easily available to us, it's a very damning indictment of where our industry is. So that's the first thing to say. We don't have many opportunities. And this goes back to my point about why Islamic banks are so damaging. Because if we had looked at this 30 years ago, even 10 years ago, we would have found solutions, right? And so one of the damages Islamic banks have done is that it's prevented solutions being developed in the market. So we're left with a massive void as investors. Let's say I have $10,000. I'll put 5,000 in the stock market. Maybe I'll put a couple of thousand in crypto, but 3 or 4,000, I want to keep it safe. I want to know it's there. And if you put it in a bank with 0% interest, it's going to be worth less. And inflation is getting to some serious levels, right? So if I keep it in the bank for 3 years, now it's not $2,000. Probably it's worth $1,500. You're damaging your wealth that way. So Muslims need something where they can just, I guess, passively invest in an asset class that's just hedging against inflation. It's just keeping their wealth. And we don't have these in Islamic finance. So, but one good thing is there are some startups who are looking at this, right? In the US, I know there's a couple of things are happening. There's a couple of crowdfunding platforms. In the UK as well, there's a couple of platforms that are beginning to take off. They're very immature and they're very young, but it's good to see young Muslims in the fintech space developing things. And these are guys who are not coming from the banking space. They're and this is where fintech is. A lot of fintech is a non-banking space. They're challenging banks, and so they're coming without all the baggage of Islamic banking and debt and interest, and they're creating new interesting things. So it's a very young area. It's very, very young. There are 2 or 3 platforms in the UK that are trying to do this. I know there's in Indonesia, for example, there's a very active peer-to-peer lending sector. And I think there's about 100 active platforms. About 6 or 7 are Sharia compliant. And I'm really supportive of all of them, even though the ones that I've seen, they do tend to look a bit like loans at interest, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think the reason I'm supportive of them is that because they're not banks and they're not dependent upon credit creation, they're actually taking, once you're taking money from investors and allocating it, you have the ability to move away from interest. It might take time because you need to wait the market to develop, but Islamic banks can't do that. They can never move away from it because they work on credit creation. It's not even real money. So when I see somewhat real, Muslims working with real investors and real capital, even in the short term, if they're doing things that look a bit like lending at interest, I'll generally be supportive of them as long as they have a vision to try to move away from it, because they can move away from it. So in answer to your question, we don't have many solutions like that. And I think that's a real shame. And that's one of the things that I want to do at Meydan. We're focusing on growth companies at the moment, but I'm already speaking to companies in our network. I want to develop paper for Muslims, securities that give a reasonably good security of capital and deliver returns based on mature cash flow within companies, not startups and not risky companies, but basically supply chain. I'm a big believer in supply chain, that people and companies are actually doing things and making things and selling things, that this is the backbone of any economy. And I think cash flows from there with relatively low risk can be securitized and delivered as alternatives to Sukuk. So you can buy 1 or 2 year paper denominated in dollars or pounds or euros, and you'll get your return based on the revenue and the supply chain of existing companies. And that's one thing we're looking to develop as an alternative to this DCM asset class, which really it doesn't exist for Muslims today, which is a real shame.
Right. That's good. That's hopeful. I like that because I think the most common question I got when I asked the audience, what do you want me to ask Safdar, is what is the solution? We know that Safdar is sort of not a fan of Islamic finance. So what is the solution? What are some practical things that Muslims can do? And what I'm hearing from you is that perhaps you don't have much hope in Islamic banking, but you have a lot of hope in the fintech space and the solutions that can come out from there. And what I'm also hearing from you is that the solution isn't ready yet, but it's something that sincere people are working on. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I would add to that is that the solutions are not just coming from Muslims. I see good solutions in the conventional space as a consequence of fintech, where you just have ethical people who are trying to do the right thing. So, for example, in insurance, so I'm working on a project to try to bring takaful to Europe and the UK, and it's not easy because it's quite a complicated product if you do it right. But in America, for example, there's a very similar product which maybe you might know. It's Lemonade, right? And they operate at a principal level. They operate on very similar principles to takaful, where the premiums that are paid remain with the policyholders. And if there's an excess, then you can choose what to do with it. You can get a discount, you can give it to charity. And this is seen as ethical, and it's communal, and it's transparent. And this is very similar to takaful. So I'm a big supporter of something like that. But it's not from Muslims, and it's not intended to be Sharia compliant. So I'm not saying it's Sharia compliant, but I'm saying that when you have ethical people trying to do things the right way, often you're going to find a convergence with good Islamic finance. And also in the UK, there's an entity that is looking at student finance and student loans. And I think they might have it approved as Sharia compliant, but that was never their aim. So what they do is they actually get involved with the university, and they get the university to fund the student, and it's repaid in the future. So in a way, for university, it's also giving them a future lease type income, ijara type income from the student. And so again,
also incentive for the university to make sure that the education they give is practical and will actually increase the income of their
students. And then I've seen how university courses have changed in the UK since I went to university about 20-30 years ago. And if you're going to go to a market and say to universities, look, whatever course you offer, where the government's going to pay the fees, then you made the point earlier about how do you incentivize people. So then universities are then incentivized to get as many students signing up as possible. Who cares about the quality of the courses? Who cares if they can't get jobs related to what they're doing and they're unemployed for 10 years because the government's already paid the university? It's the government taking the risk. And that's why we see a lot of courses, airy-fairy and fluffy courses that, they just make no sense to me, but they're fit within the model of incentivization. And so the point I was making about that, about tuition and the insurance, is that there are interesting models that are coming out in the world due to fintech that are very much aligned with Islamic principles, right? It's not just Muslims who are doing it. So even though it's in the very early stages, and you're right, I have zero hope in banking. I have zero hope in Islamic banking, and that's just the way it is. I mean, only Allah knows if some good can come of it. I really don't know, but I've absolutely given up with that. But I have hope in Muslims. I have hope in fintech, and so I know crypto is a new thing. I'm not quite sure where I stand on crypto, but something like, I think decentralized finance has good opportunities for Muslims. I'm yet to see that being evidenced, but I do hope. We have a lot of Muslims who are clued up on tech and crypto. They know a lot about it. And I really hope there's a way we can support them and direct them to doing something ethical and good in the finance space.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, just from the sample of crypto projects that come my way, some are committing the same mistake that was committed in sort of constructing the Islamic banking industry, which is that they're trying to basically provide the same exact products you could find somewhere else, but repackaging it in a Muslim-friendly way, right? So whenever the question I think all entrepreneurs in the crypto space should ask themselves, especially Muslim entrepreneurs, is, can I get this service somewhere else? Can I get this exact same service somewhere else? What is the unique utility of this project? And that's a question that's I think seldom answered in a satisfactory way by a lot of Muslim entrepreneurs. It's something to keep in mind. Like, we're Like, don't be on the day of judgment, don't be guilty of monetizing people's motivation to do the right thing.
Yeah.
In an unjust way. Like, you can monetize that if you're actually providing them with some value, but monetizing it without providing them with value, I think is really dangerous for your afterlife. I would also say something. My sort of litmus test for a product being substantive versus not substantive is to see whether or not that product has non-Muslim customers.
Yeah.
Because if it does have non-Muslim customers, then you have proof beyond a shadow of a doubt that there's value there that these non-Muslim customers are getting that they can't get from some other product. And there's something that is motivating these non-Muslim customers to use that product beyond just the marketing of that product. That's really, I think, the litmus test that's really useful for people to use. Like, I get it. In the beginning, you're probably going to attract Muslim customers the most because that's who you're targeting. But over time, you should see non-Muslim customers start to use your product. If you've been in the business for 10 years and you have nothing but Muslim customers, then you should start asking yourself, why is that? Maybe the fact of the matter is you're selling the word halal, or you're selling the word Islamic in reality.
Yeah. This is a very important point. So I think because of, certainly in my view, how the word Islamic and halal and Sharia compliant, I think they have a lot of baggage associated with them because they've been misused and Islamic banking is a perfect example of that. And also companies do misuse them. So what I am seeing is that there's more people I speak to in this space that are understanding that. And so when you look at your primary selling point, your USP, if it's the fact that you're Islamic, then you have to be a bit careful about that, right? So nowadays, when we're the companies I'm advising, when we're thinking about social media, websites, what do you put? There's a general consensus that I'm seeing now that people don't want to emphasize too quickly that you're Islamic or Sharia compliant. That if somebody wants to know, they can find out, but that doesn't need to be your primary banner to attract people, because often, that's not an easy banner. It's not an easy banner to attract people, especially if you have a product that you want to stand out. And also, I'm of the view that if you're going to mention that you're Islamic or Sharia compliant or halal, then automatically you must hold yourself to a very high standard, right? You cannot then claim that benefit and then do something shady with it, right? You got to be cleaner than clean. In fact, if somebody, if I see a business and I see they're saying that it's halal or Sharia compliant, I will look at them more critically than any other business, because I feel that that's a great responsibility to have. It's a real burden. And I think you're right. One of the good evidences that you're doing something right is if a non-Muslim looks at what you're doing, and he doesn't even care if you're Islamic or not. He'll just say, "Oh, you're doing this. That sounds really good. I'd like to be a part of it." And you never even talk about Islam because you don't need to. Right? You just talk about the product, and hopefully, I think these are the kinds of products and the markets that we really have scope to grow into.
Right. Well, this has been fascinating, Safdar. I really appreciate your insight. I think that you have a very unique background that has enabled you to form a perspective that very few people have the privilege of being able to form. So I think it was very useful for me to hear it, and I hope it was very useful for the audience. And so in the end, are there any parting thoughts that you would like to leave us with?
Thank you very much for that. I guess a couple. So one is, in terms of my motivation, I'm trying to be involved now in things that are are quite productive and good for Muslims and supporting businesses. And I think that's a real privilege to be in that position. I would say also that every day I feel real obligation on myself to speak about what I know. And so I don't think I'm ever going to stop speaking about the misrepresentation of what I see in my religion and Islamic banking, because I feel that as a real obligation that I'm going to be answerable for. As to what did you learned this, but what did you do about it? Did you tell people about it, or did you keep quiet? So that's never going to change for me. Every day I lose sleep over this, and I really feel a sense of outrage. But I think that's not always negative. I think that can be used positively. Otherwise, I know there's a few things that I said that people won't agree with, but I think what I would like people to understand is that I'm a Muslim, just like everybody else. I'm thinking about my afterlife, and I'm trying to serve my Creator, and I'm not here to. I'm not a Muslim hater. I'm in fact one of the greatest fans of Islamic finance that I know. So if you see something technically wrong in what I say, or you disagree, then that's absolutely okay. But I really hope people would not question my motivation or my reason for saying or doing things, because I'm trying to just be honest and trying to be a good Muslim. And if I've helped people to understand something, then I'm grateful for that. That's a result of the privilege I've had and the experience that I've had. If somebody had disagreed with anything, then I said, I'm very comfortable with that. I'm very comfortable with disagreement, but my opinions come from very long line of experience and knowledge and firsthand doing things. And I know not everybody comes from that background, and I'm very happy for the opportunity to speak with you and to talk about the things that we said. And I hope I do justice to the kind invitation that I had from you and your team.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that, Safdar. Yeah, it was a pleasure having you. And I pride myself on being a pretty good judge of character. I can tell when people are sincere or not. My impression of you is that you are sincere. And so I would just reiterate what you did say, is that this is your honest analysis, and you're coming from a sincere place. You're trying to be candid, but be fair at the same time. And that's really what I'm after. I'm after that type of opinion being shared with the audience, because I think that's really useful to be shared. A candid opinion that comes from experience, that comes from sincerity. I think when an audience gets exposed to enough of those opinions, they're able to form an educated judgment. So yeah, this was really fun and useful, I think, inshallah. And I'd really love to have you back on the show, inshallah, in the future to tell us a bit more about the development of your startups and the solutions that you're working on. That would be great. So thank you, Safdar. And
Fantastic.
thank you all for tuning in as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rakan. Thank you.